The morning of May 11th, 1945, radar Picket Station 15, 60 miles north of Okinawa. Lieutenant Commander Baron J. Mullaney stood on the bridge of USS Hadley, watching his radar screen fill with contacts that seemed impossible to count. 156 aircraft, all inbound, all kamikaze. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. His destroyer and USS Hugh W. Hadley Evans stood alone between this death swarm and the American amphibious fleet anchored off Okinawa's beaches. 2 ships, 300 suicide pilots. The mathematics seemed absurd. In his ammunition magazines below deck sat shells marked with green bands and cryptic letters, VT, variable time, they told the crew. But Mullaney knew the truth. Each shell contained a miniature radar system, a technological miracle that could think for itself, decide when to explode, and turn near misses into kills. What happened in the next 95 minutes would prove that American science had created a weapon so revolutionary it could defeat an enemy willing to die. The proximity fuse, developed in absolute secrecy, manufactured by 87 companies and deployed across the Pacific in quantities that defied comprehension, was about to face its ultimate test. The divine wind versus the thinking shell. Fanaticism versus physics. Human sacrifice versus American engineering. The story of how this happened, how a device smaller than a coffee can change the outcome of the Pacific War, began not in America's laboratories, but in Britain's darkest hour, when survival itself seemed impossible. October 30th, 1939. Exeter, England. As the first winter of war settled over Britain, a young scientist named William Butemont submitted a proposal that would change warfare forever. Working at the Air Defense Research and Development Establishment with colleagues Edward Shire and Amherst Thompson, Butemont had conceived something that seemed like science fiction, an artillery shell that could think. The concept emerged from brutal mathematical reality. During the First World War, anti-aircraft gunners had fired an average of 8,500 shells for each enemy aircraft destroyed. By 1939, with planes flying faster and higher, the ratio had worsened. Britain's survival in the coming air war would depend on dramatically improving these odds. Butemont's solution, radio waves that would detect approaching aircraft and detonate shells automatically at the optimal distance. But he faced a problem that seemed insurmountable. With 1939 technology, his radio fuse would need to survive being fired from a gun at forces exceeding 20,000 times normal gravity, spin at 30,000 revolutions per minute, operate in temperatures from -50 to +100 degrees Fahrenheit, and still maintain the sensitivity to detect aircraft 70 feet away. British scientists constructed prototypes by June 1940, testing them in unrotated projectiles, essentially rockets against balloon targets. The tests proved the concept viable, but revealed a crushing technological challenge. No existing electronic components could survive the violence of being fired from a gun. The solution would come from across the Atlantic, delivered in Britain's most desperate hour by one of history's most important scientific missions. September 6th, 1940, Halifax, Nova Scotia. The Canadian Pacific liner, Duchess of Richmond, arrived carrying cargo more valuable than gold. Sir Henry Tizard and a black metal deed box containing every major British military secret. The Tizard mission, as history would remember it, represented an unprecedented gamble. A nation fighting for survival, sharing its most closely guarded military technologies with a country not yet at war. The delegation assembled in Washington on September 12th, taking residence at the Wardman Park Hotel. For a week, they revealed Britain's technological treasures, radar systems, jet engine designs, explosive technologies, chemical weapons research. But on September 19th, in a conference room overlooking Connecticut Avenue, British physicist Dr. John Cockcroft presented something special to a young American physicist who had been summoned specifically for this meeting. Dr. Merle Anthony Tuve, 39 years old, sat transfixed as Cockcroft explained British proximity fuse research. Tuve, raised in rural South Dakota, had spent his childhood tinkering with radio sets alongside his friend Ernest Lawrence, who would later win the Nobel Prize. Just 1 month earlier, in August 1940, Vannevar Bush had appointed Tuve to lead a new, secret section of the National Defense Research Committee, Section T, created specifically to develop proximity fuses. Tuve's appointment hadn't been random. Earlier that summer, he had been listening to radio reports of the London Blitz with his wife. The broadcaster described children being pulled from rubble, entire neighborhoods eliminated in minutes, the desperate inadequacy of British air defenses. Tuve had turned to his wife with tears in his eyes. "We have to find a way to stop those bombers," he said. "Technology has to provide the answer." Now, in that Washington conference room, Cockcroft was handing him exactly that opportunity. But the British concept, while brilliant, remained theoretical. No one had solved the fundamental problem, how to make vacuum tubes and electronic circuits that could survive being shot from a gun. Cockcroft was honest about British limitations. They lacked the industrial capacity and resources to pursue the massive development program required. America, with its vast industrial base and protected geography, represented the only hope. Tuve left the meeting with a mission that would consume the next 5 years of his life and mobilize the entire American electronics industry. The challenge seemed impossible. The solution would require innovations that didn't yet exist, manufacturing techniques never before attempted, and a scale of production that defied comprehension. December 1940, Department of Terrestrial Magnetism, Carnegie Institution, Washington, D.C. The mansion at 5241 Broad Branch Road had been transformed into the nerve center of America's most secret weapons program. Tuve had assembled a team that would reshape warfare. Richard B. Roberts, a nuclear physicist who had worked with Niels Bohr, Henry H. Porter, an expert in acoustics, Robert B. Broad, who had studied cosmic rays, Lawrence Hafstad, a specialist in nuclear physics, Lloyd Berkner, a pioneer in ionospheric research, and a 26-year-old physicist named James Van Allen, whose later discovery of Earth's radiation belts would make him famous, but whose wartime contribution would remain classified for decades. The challenge they faced defied every assumption about electronics. A proximity fuse would need to be a complete radar system, transmitter, receiver, amplifier, and detonator, compressed into a space smaller than a coffee can. It would need to generate radio waves, detect their reflection from targets, process the signal, and trigger detonation, all while experiencing forces that would destroy any conventional electronic device. Van Allen took on the most fundamental challenge, creating vacuum tubes that could survive being fired from a gun. Traditional vacuum tubes, with their delicate glass envelopes and fragile filaments, shattered at forces of just 100 times gravity. The proximity fuse would need to survive acceleration 200 times greater. For 6 months, Van Allen worked with a Massachusetts hearing aid company, Raytheon, developing miniaturized tubes with revolutionary construction. Instead of hanging filaments from delicate wires, they created rigid structures using techniques borrowed from hearing aid manufacturing. The breakthrough came in January 1942 with Van Allen's mousetrap spring innovation, a mechanical system that protected tube filaments during the massive acceleration of firing, then released them for normal operation during flight. The patent for this device would remain classified until 1947, but it represented one of the most important electronic innovations of the war. Lloyd Berkner achieved another crucial breakthrough in December 1940, developing a circuit design that used separate transmitter and receiver functions, significantly advancing beyond the British Autodyne concept. His innovation allowed the fuse to detect targets at greater distances with higher reliability, essential for effective combat performance. By March 1942, the project had outgrown Carnegie's facilities. Johns Hopkins University established the Applied Physics Laboratory. In an abandoned Chevrolet dealership at 8621 Georgia Avenue in Silver Spring, Maryland, The building still smelled of motor oil and rubber when the first scientists arrived, but within weeks, it housed the most advanced electronics laboratory in the world. Merle Tuvey became APL's first director, establishing a laboratory culture that would define American weapons development for decades. Signs appeared on every wall. "I don't want any damn fool in this laboratory to save money. I only want him to save time." Another read. "Our moral responsibility goes all the way to the final battle use of this unit. Its failure there is our failure." The technical specifications of what they achieved still seem impossible, even by today's standards. The proximity fuse operated as a continuous wave radar system, transmitting at 180 to 220 megahertz, frequencies that in 1940 were considered the cutting edge of radio technology. The projectile's metal shell body served as the transmitting antenna, excited by a small conical antenna in the nose. The entire system employed an autodyne configuration where a single oscillator tube functioned as both transmitter and receiver, an elegance of design born from brutal space constraints. Inside a space barely 5 inches long and 2 inches in diameter, they packed 4 miniaturized vacuum tubes, 130 electronic components, a wet cell battery, safety mechanisms, and the detonator system. The oscillator tube generated a 70 megahertz signal with harmonics at 180 to 220 megahertz. When these radio waves bounced off approaching targets, they created interference patterns that varied the oscillator loading, producing beat frequencies in the 200 to 800 hertz range. These signals were amplified through a 2-stage amplifier, filtered for the specific frequencies that indicated an approaching target, then triggered a thyrotron gas-filled tube that initiated detonation. The power source represented another seemingly impossible innovation. Traditional batteries couldn't survive the G-forces or provide sufficient power in such a small space. The solution came from National Carbon Company, which developed a revolutionary reserve battery using liquid electrolyte stored in a glass ampule. The firing shock would shatter the ampule, and centrifugal force from the shell's spin would drive the electrolyte into stacked carbon and zinc plates, activating the battery during flight. This meant the battery had unlimited shelf life before use, but provided full power exactly when needed. Safety systems prevented premature detonation through multiple mechanisms. Centrifugal switches remained open until the shell reached proper spin rate. A half-second to 0.7 of a second arming delay after firing prevented detonation near friendly forces. The sensitivity increased gradually during flight, reaching maximum effectiveness at typical engagement ranges. January 5th, 1943, 0800 hours, Southwest Pacific, near Guadalcanal. USS Helena's radar detected incoming aircraft. 4 Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers, approaching at 12,000 feet. Lieutenant Russell "Red" Cochran, commanding the aft 5-inch battery, had been briefed on the new ammunition just days before. In the magazine below, gunners loaded shells marked with special green bands, the Navy's indication of proximity-fused rounds. "Range 8,000 yards and closing," called the rangefinder operator. Cochran watched the approaching planes through his binoculars. In conventional combat, his guns would need direct hits, nearly impossible against maneuvering aircraft. But these shells were different. They only needed to pass within 70 feet of the target. "Commence firing." The first salvo erupted from Helena's guns. The shells traced red arcs across the morning sky, passing near the lead valve. Nothing happened. They were still too distant. The second salvo followed 15 seconds later. At 5,000 yards from Helena, 11,000 feet altitude, one shell passed approximately 60 feet from the lead bomber. The explosion looked different from anything Cochran had seen before. Instead of the shell continuing past the plane or exploding on impact, it detonated in mid-air, sending a perfect sphere of fragments outward. The valve's wing sheared off instantly. The engine, peppered with hundreds of steel fragments, burst into flames. The aircraft didn't break apart dramatically. It simply ceased flying, transforming from a controlled dive bomber into a tumbling mass of burning aluminum. Splash 1. called the spotter. The remaining Vals broke off their attack, but Helena's guns tracked them. 3 more salvos, 12 more proximity-fused shells. A second Val exploded when a shell detonated 40 feet below its fuselage, the upward-directed fragments piercing fuel tanks and killing the pilot instantly. In the radio room, the combat report was already being encoded. Enemy aircraft engaged with special ammunition. 2 confirmed destroyed. Ammunition performance exceeded all expectations. What the report didn't capture was the psychological impact on Helena's crew. Gunner's mate, First Class Anthony Puleo, later recalled, "We couldn't believe it. For months, we'd fired thousands of rounds at planes, maybe hitting one if we were lucky. Now, we were knocking them down with just a few shots. It was like God himself was guiding our shells." Samuel Eliot Morrison, the Navy's official historian present in the Pacific, would write, "The smoking fuselages and bright surface bonfires attested the accuracy of anti-aircraft batteries and the efficiency of the super-secret Mark 32 shell fuse. The impact rippled through the Pacific Fleet with stunning speed. On August 12, 1942, even before Helena's combat debut, USS Cleveland had conducted the test that convinced the Navy to stake everything on this new technology. In Chesapeake Bay, the cruiser faced 3 radio-controlled drone aircraft, sophisticated targets that could perform evasive maneuvers. The test was scheduled for 2 days. It lasted less than 2 hours. First drone destroyed with the second burst of proximity-fused shells. Second drone eliminated on the 4th burst. Third drone obliterated on the 1st burst. The Navy observers were so shocked they cancelled the remaining tests and immediately ordered mass production. Admiral William Spike Blandy, watching from Cleveland's bridge, turned to his aide. "This changes everything. Every ship in the Pacific needs these rounds immediately." By spring 1943, proximity fuses were flowing to the Pacific in extraordinary quantities. The first 5,000 rounds went to USS Enterprise, USS Saratoga, and USS Helena under the personal supervision of Commander William S. Parsons, the same officer who would later arm the atomic bomb aboard Enola Gay. Security was absolute. The shells were stored in special magazines with armed guards. Only gunnery officers were briefed on their capabilities. Crew members were told they were special incendiary rounds to explain their different appearance. The statistics from 1943 revealed the transformation. Although proximity fuses comprised only 25% of anti-aircraft ammunition fired, they accounted for 51% of all Japanese aircraft destroyed by naval gunfire. The rounds per kill ratio dropped from 508 for conventional time-fused shells to just 155 for proximity-fused ammunition, a 3-fold improvement that would only increase as crews gained experience. Gunner's mate, Second Class Robert Chen, aboard USS Essex, documented the change in his diary. March 1943, fired 300 rounds at attacking Bettys, no hits. September 1943, new ammunition arrived with green bands, fired 80 rounds at attacking Vals, destroyed 3. The guys think we've gotten better at shooting. They don't know it's the shells doing the thinking now. June 19th, 1944, 1000 hours, Philippine Sea, 200 miles west of Guam. Lieutenant James Van Allen stood on the flag bridge of USS Washington, watching the radar screens fill with approaching contacts. The same James Van Allen, who had developed the shock-proof vacuum tubes, now witnessed his invention's ultimate test. The Japanese had launched their entire carrier aviation strength, 423 aircraft, in a desperate attempt to destroy the American fleet supporting the Marianas invasion. Van Allen had been commissioned in November 1942 and spent 16 months training gunnery officers throughout the Pacific Fleet. He knew every ship was loaded with proximity-fused ammunition. He knew the theoretical effectiveness, but theory and combat were different things. Raid 1, bearing 265, Angels 2069 aircraft, announced the Combat Information Center. Admiral Mark Mitcher ordered, "Launch all fighters, gun crews to battle stations." As Hellcat fighters tore into the Japanese formations, those that broke through faced a wall of proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire unlike anything in naval history. Van Allen watched from Washington's bridge as the sky filled with black puffs, each one representing a proximity-fused detonation. Japanese planes began falling like rain. A Zero fighter dove on USS South Dakota 1,000 yards from Washington. Van Allen watched South Dakota's 5-inch guns track smoothly, firing measured bursts. The third shell detonated 50 feet from the Zero. The plane didn't explode. It simply came apart, wings separating from fuselage, engine falling free, the pilot's body tumbling through space. "It was systematic slaughter," Van Allen would later write to his wife. "The proximity fuses turned our ships into fortresses. The Japanese pilots were brave. They kept coming, even as their squadrons were annihilated. But courage couldn't overcome technology." By day's end, the Japanese had lost 315 carrier aircraft, plus 50 land-based planes. American losses, 29 aircraft, mostly from operational accidents. The one-sided nature of the battle effectively ended Japanese carrier aviation. They would never again launch a conventional carrier strike. Their next major tactic would be born from desperation: kamikaze. Aboard USS Bunker Hill, aviation radio man Charles Calhoun recorded, "We could see them falling everywhere, in flames, in pieces, intact but dead. The gunners were laughing and crying at the same time. After 2 years of taking it from Japanese air attacks, we were finally giving it back. The proximity fuses made our guns godlike." October 25, 1944, 0740 hours, Leyte Gulf, Philippines. Lieutenant Commander Robert Roberts watched in horror from USS White Plains as a Zero fighter, already burning from anti-aircraft hits, deliberately crashed into USS St. Louis flight deck. The explosion detonated torpedo warheads in the hangar deck. Within minutes, St. Louis rolled over and sank. The first major warship lost to kamikaze attack. The Japanese had discovered the only way to counter proximity fuses, eliminate the need to survive the attack. A plane destroyed 50 feet from its target by a proximity fuse had failed its mission. A kamikaze destroyed 50 feet from its target would still crash into the ship through momentum. The divine wind had begun. Statistical analysis revealed the tactical revolution. Conventional Japanese attacks now achieved only 2% success rates, 23 hits from 1,092 attempts between October 1944 and January 1945. Kamikaze attacks achieved 34% success, 121 hits from 352 attempts. The proximity fuse had made conventional attacks suicidal, so the Japanese embraced suicide as a tactic. But even against kamikaze attacks, proximity fuses proved invaluable. During the Philippines campaign, anti-aircraft guns claimed 231 kills or deflections from 364 kamikaze attacks, a 64% success rate. Proximity fuses accounted for 44% of all 5-inch gun kills. Without them, American casualties would have doubled or tripled. Gunner's mate William Fomby aboard USS Nashville described the new reality. "The Japs came at us like they didn't care about living anymore. Because they didn't. Our proximity fuses would blow them to pieces, but the pieces kept coming. We'd turn a whole plane into confetti, but confetti traveling at 300 miles per hour still hits hard. The fuses saved us from most of them, but the ones that got through, God help those ships." May 11th, 1945. 1500 hours. Radar Picket Station 15, 60 miles north of Okinawa. Commander Baron J. Mullaney of USS Hadley watched the radar screen with growing dread. Kikusui No. 6 was incoming. Over 150 Japanese aircraft in coordinated kamikaze attack. Hadley and USS Hugh W. Hadley Evans stood alone at the picket station. The fleet's early warning and first defense. Multiple raids, all vectors, estimated 150 plus bandits, reported the Combat Information Center. Mullaney had drilled his crew relentlessly. Every man knew his job. The 5-inch magazines were loaded entirely with proximity-fused shells. The gun crews had practiced until they could maintain 15 rounds per minute per gun, the maximum sustainable rate. At 15-20 hours, the first wave attacked 12 aircraft from the north. Hadley's guns opened fire at 12,000 yards. The proximity fuses began their deadly work. First plane destroyed at 8,000 yards, second at 6,000, third at 4,000. The fourth, kamikaze, already burning, crashed 50 yards off the starboard beam, showering the ship with debris but causing no serious damage. But this was just the beginning. For the next 95 minutes, Hadley fought for survival against continuous waves of attackers. The gun barrels glowed red-hot, ammunition handlers collapsed from exhaustion and were replaced. The proximity fuses never stopped working. Gunner's mate, second class Robert Eichenberg, manning gun mount 52, later testified, "They came from everywhere, high, low, all directions. The proximity fuses were beautiful. We'd fire, and 3 seconds later, there'd be an explosion and burning pieces falling. Fire again, another explosion. It was like a rhythm. Boom, boom, boom. Wait 3 seconds. Explosion. Boom, boom, boom. Explosion." At 16-15 hours, Hadley's luck ran out. 3 kamikazes, all heavily damaged by proximity fuse explosions, but still flying, crashed into the ship in quick succession. A bomb from a 4th aircraft exploded in the after-engine room. Hadley was devastated. 30 killed, 68 wounded, engineering spaces flooded, fires raging. But the ship survived, and the gun crews kept fighting. Even as damage control parties fought fires and flooding, the forward guns continued engaging attacking aircraft. When the action ended at 16:55 hours, Hadley had shot down 23 aircraft, an all-time record for a destroyer in a single engagement. Commander Mullaney's after-action report stated, "The proximity fuse was indispensable to our survival. Without it, we would have been overwhelmed in the first 20 minutes. Even damaged and burning, the fuses allowed us to continue defending ourselves when conventional ammunition would have been useless against such numbers." The Okinawa campaign's final statistics were sobering. 1,900 Japanese aircraft in kamikaze attacks, 368 U.S. ships damaged, 34 sunk, 4,907 sailors killed, 4,824 wounded. Yet, post-war analysis concluded that without proximity fuses, casualties would have exceeded 15,000, with over 100 ships sunk. The proximity fuse had made the difference between painful victory and potential defeat. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. June 13th, 1944, 0400 hours, London. The distinctive pulse jet engine sound echoed across the city, a harsh buzzing that would soon terrorize millions. The first V-1 flying bomb of the main offensive impacted in Grove Road, Bethnal Green, killing 6 civilians, including Mrs. Carrie Harrison, who became the first London victim of Hitler's revenge weapon. But unlike the Blitz of 1940-41, London now possessed a defense that would have seemed miraculous 4 years earlier. On June 12th, one day before the V-1 offensive began, and 6 days after D-Day, Winston Churchill had made a decision that would save thousands of lives. Against the advice of security officials who feared the technology would fall into German hands, Churchill authorized the use of proximity fuses for London's defense. General Sir Frederick Pyle, commanding Anti-Aircraft Command, had deployed 500 heavy anti-aircraft guns, British 3.7-inch and American 90mm weapons, in a defensive belt south of London. Each gun was linked to SCR-584 microwave radar and M9 electronic gun directors, creating an automated defensive system. But without proximity fuses, even this sophisticated system achieved only 24% success rates in the first week. Squadron leader Prudence Hill, serving in the filter room at RAF Stanmore, tracked the transformation. The first week was terrifying. We'd plot dozens of V1s, approaching London, and most got through. The guns were firing constantly, but hitting almost nothing. Then something changed in the second week. Suddenly, the guns started destroying everything. The plotting board showed V1 after V1 disappearing 10 miles from London. What Hill witnessed was the arrival of proximity fuses flown directly from American production lines. By the second week, gunners were destroying 46% of engaged V1s. Third week, 67%. Fourth week, 79%. The improvement was so dramatic that the German intelligence reported to Hitler that the British must have developed a secret anti-rocket weapon. Gunnery Sergeant Kenneth Brown of the U.S. 184th Fayette Gun Battalion, stationed near Biggin Hill, described the transformation. With regular shells, we had to predict exactly where the buzz bomb would be and when. 1 second off, 1 degree wrong, and we'd miss. With proximity fuses, we just had to get close. The shell would do the rest. It was like going from throwing darts blindfolded to throwing them with your eyes open. On August 28, 1944, the defensive system achieved its ultimate success. Early warning radar detected 104 V1s launched at London. The proximity-fused guns destroyed 96. The RAF fighters got 4. Only 4 reached London. The V1 threat to London was effectively neutralized. The statistics told the story. 9,300 V1 missiles launched at London over 80 days. Approximately 2,340 destroyed by proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire. Without this defense, estimated additional casualties would have exceeded 20,000 dead and 50,000 wounded. Churchill would later write, "The proximity fuse, more than any other single development, saved London from devastation by flying bombs." December 15th, 1944. Antwerp, Belgium. Captain William Hartmann of the 407th 8AA Gun Battalion watched the latest intelligence report with grim satisfaction. In the past 24 hours, his battalion had destroyed 89 of 92 V1s targeted at Antwerp Harbour, a 97% success rate that would have been fantasy just weeks earlier. Antwerp was the vital lung through which the Allied armies in Europe breathed. Through its 26 miles of docks flowed 25,000 tons of supplies daily. Food, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies. Without Antwerp, the Allied advance into Germany would strangle. Hitler knew this. Between October 24th, 1944 and March 27th, 1945, Germany would launch 4,900 V1s at Antwerp, more than half the number fired at London. The defense of Antwerp had started poorly. In early November, conventional time-fused shells achieved only 40% success rates. V1s were impacting the port area at a rate of 30 per day, threatening to close the vital supply line. Then in mid-December, a Lancaster bomber made an emergency landing at Antwerp Airport. Its cargo, 10,000 proximity fuses flown directly from Cincinnati on Churchill's personal order. Technical Sergeant Joseph Kozak, operating an SCR-584 radar unit, witnessed the immediate change. Before proximity fuses, we'd track a buzz bomb perfectly, feed perfect data to the guns, and watch our shells explode behind, in front, above, below, everywhere but on target. After proximity fuses, same tracking, same data, but now every gun burst meant a dead buzz bomb. It was like someone had given us guided missiles. The German V1 crews, launching from sites in Holland, couldn't understand what was happening. Launch sites that had successfully delivered 80% of their missiles to Antwerp suddenly saw 90% destroyed in flight. They increased launch rates. They varied launch times. They tried flying V1s at different altitudes. Nothing worked. The proximity fuses destroyed them all with mechanical efficiency. Private First Class Raymond Miller, ammunition handler with the 126th 8AA Battalion, described the reality of sustained operations. "We were firing so many proximity fuses that we ran out of storage. Trucks would arrive from the port with new shells, drive straight to the gun positions, and we'd load them directly into the guns. No inventory, no paperwork, just shoot, shoot, shoot." In one 24-hour period, My gun position fired 1,400 rounds. That's 1,400 proximity fuses, each one a miracle of engineering, burned through in one day. By February 1945, the defense had become so effective that German V-1 crews began suffering morale collapse. Luftwaffe Colonel Max Wachtel, commanding the V-1 offensive, reported to Hitler that continuing attacks on Antwerp were feeding missiles into a furnace. Hitler ordered the attacks to continue regardless. They did, achieving nothing except depleting Germany's dwindling resources. The final statistics for Antwerp's defense: 2,183 V-1s destroyed out of 2,394 engaged. 91.2% success rate. The port never closed. The supplies never stopped flowing. The Allied armies continued their advance into Germany, sustained by the lifeline that proximity fuses had kept open. The morning of December 16, 1944, marked not just the beginning of Germany's last major offensive, but also the combat debut of proximity fuses in ground warfare. At 05:30 hours near Monschau, Colonel Axel Svensson of the 406th Artillery Group received frantic reports from forward observers. German forces were attacking in overwhelming strength. The 38th Cavalry Squadron, holding the line, was outnumbered 10-1. Svensson faced a terrible decision. In his ammunition bunkers sat thousands of proximity-fused shells delivered just days before with strict orders not to be used in ground combat under any circumstances. Risk of capture by enemy forces too great. But without them, the cavalry squadron would be overrun within hours. At 0600 hours, Svensson gave the order that would revolutionize ground warfare. Load proximity fuses, set for airburst. The first salvo landed among German infantry advancing across snow-covered fields near Hofen. Instead of exploding on impact, allowing soldiers in foxholes to survive, the shells detonated at their optimal height above ground. The effect was apocalyptic. Fragments rained downward in a lethal cone, reaching into foxholes, behind walls, under vehicles. There was no cover, no protection, nowhere to hide. Forward observer Lieutenant Richard Ralston, watching through binoculars, reported, "First salvo air burst over German infantry company in open. Estimate 80% casualties. Survivors running back to wood line. Request immediate repeat on wood line." The second salvo air burst in the trees where Germans sought cover. The combination of shell fragments and wood splinters created a killing zone 100 yards deep into the forest. German soldiers, veterans of 4 years of combat, experienced something entirely new: artillery that killed regardless of cover. Feldwebel Otto Hartmann, 12th Volksgrenadier Division, survived the barrage and was captured 2 days later. His interrogation report stated, "The artillery was unlike anything we had experienced in Russia or Normandy. We dove into foxholes, but the shells exploded above us. We ran to the forest, but the shells followed and exploded in the treetops. Men were screaming that the Americans had a new secret weapon. Entire platoons were eliminated in seconds." Word of Svensson's success spread rapidly. By December 19th, Eisenhower had formally requested permission to use proximity fuses across the entire front. Authorization came December 21st. Within hours, every American artillery unit in the Ardennes was firing proximity-fused shells. General George S. Patton, never one for understatement, wrote to the War Department on December 28th, "The new shell with the funny fuse is devastating. The other night, we caught a German battalion trying to cross the Sauer River. We hit them with proximity fuses. Battalion time on target. By actual count, 702 dead. The few survivors were so demoralized, they surrendered immediately. This is a magnificent weapon." He added, prophetically, "I think when all armies get this shell, we will have to devise some new method of warfare. I'm glad you all thought of it first." The proximity fuse that was revolutionizing battlefields from the Pacific to Europe began in the most unlikely places: converted bakeries, former automobile garages, and Christmas light factories across America. The transformation of Merle Tuve's laboratory prototype into mass production represented one of the greatest industrial achievements in history. By late 1942, the challenge seemed insurmountable. Each proximity fuse required 130 precision components that had never been mass-produced before. The miniature vacuum tubes alone required tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The entire assembly had to be perfect. A single failed component meant a dud shell that might kill American soldiers instead of the enemy. The mobilization began with Crosley Corporation in Cincinnati. Powell Crosley Jr., who had made his fortune selling radios and refrigerators, converted his entire facility to proximity fuse production. By January 1943, the assembly lines were operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Betty Morrison, assembly line worker at Crosley from 1943 to 45, recalled in a 1995 interview, "We didn't know what we were making. Security was unbelievable. We were searched, entering and leaving. No purses, no bags, nothing. We sat at benches 8 hours a day, soldering tiny components onto circuit boards. The supervisors told us we were making radio parts for aircraft. Only after the war did we learn we'd been building the proximity fuses that saved so many of our boys." The numbers escalated at rates that defied comprehension. December 1942, 500 units daily. June 1943, 8,000 daily. December 1943, 40,000 daily. By spring 1944, American factories were producing 70,000 proximity fuses every single day, more than Germany's entire monthly production of conventional fuses. Sylvania Electric Products in Ipswich Mills, Massachusetts, became the single largest producer. The company employed 10,000 workers, 80% women, in a facility that had been farmland just 18 months earlier. They produced 100 million miniature vacuum tubes, achieving a production rate of 400,000 tubes daily, equal to 2/3 of America's entire pre-war vacuum tube production. The human cost emerged only decades later. Workers used beryllium for soldering connections, unaware of its deadly nature. Pat Vlahos, whose mother worked at Sylvania, reported in 2003 she was diagnosed with malignant mesothelioma in 1983. She said she didn't know what they were building. It was all secret. The beryllium she handled every day for 3 years killed her 40 years later. The production statistics tell their own story of American industrial might. 87 companies, 110 factories, 80,000 workers at peak production. From university laboratories to Christmas light factories, from hearing aid companies to automobile parts manufacturers, America transformed its industrial base to produce the world's first smart weapon. The cost reduction achieved through mass production was equally remarkable. First units in 1942, $732, each equivalent to $11,514 in 2024. By 1945, $18 each, equivalent to $290 in 2024, a 97.5% cost reduction while maintaining 80% operational reliability, a manufacturing miracle that only American industry could achieve. The proximity fuse program's security rivaled that of the Manhattan Project, and for good reason. If Germany or Japan had captured and reproduced the technology, the Allied advantage would have vanished overnight. The security measures implemented were extraordinary, creating a fortress of secrecy that held throughout the war. Captain S.R. Schumacher of the Naval Bureau of Ordnance invented the deliberately misleading name variable time fuse, specifically to cloak the significance of the device. The Army used POSIT, meaningless letters that revealed nothing. Workers in factories were told they were making radio components or electronic parts for aircraft. Even the abbreviation VT was classified. Gun crews were told it stood for variable time. When asked, at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, security bordered on paranoia. Every employee underwent FBI background checks. The facility operated under such secrecy that local Silver Spring residents noticed groups of women arriving at night and leaving in morning, leading to speculation about the building's purpose. Security guards addressed everyone as doctor, regardless of actual position, preventing identification of key personnel. The close calls were numerous and terrifying. In July, then 1943, a DUD proximity-fused shell fired from a destroyer landed on a beach in Sicily. headquarters immediately dispatched a special recovery team by air to retrieve it before German forces could find it. They succeeded, but the incident led to new regulations restricting proximity fuse use over land until the Battle of the Bulge. In December 1944, the ultimate security nightmare occurred. During the German offensive in the Ardennes, Wehrmacht forces overran an American ammunition dump containing 20,000 proximity fuses. If German scientists had recognized what they captured, they could have potentially developed countermeasures or copied the technology. Incredibly, German engineers examined the captured fuses and concluded they were impossible. A post-war interrogation of Dr. Hans Gerdien, leading German fuse expert, revealed their thinking. We examined American fuses captured in the Ardennes. We concluded they could not function as claimed. No vacuum tube could survive the acceleration forces. The Americans were attempting to deceive us with propaganda about superweapons. The Germans had the proximity fuse in their hands and didn't believe it could work. Testimony to how far ahead American technology had leaped. Both Germany and Japan pursued proximity fuse development throughout the war, but neither achieved operational deployment, a failure that would prove decisive in their defeats. Germany's efforts were extensive but fragmented. The Luftwaffe pursued acoustic fuses triggered by aircraft engine noise. Rheinmetall Borsig developed electrostatic field fuses. The Wehrmacht tested photoelectric fuses. The Kriegsmarine experimented with magnetic influence fuses. Between 1940 and 45, German research institutions pursued 30 to 50 different proximity fuse designs. Dr. Werner Rambauske, leading German proximity fuse researcher, explained post-war, "We understood the theory perfectly. We had actually provided the British with early prototypes in the Oslo Report of 1939. But we lacked three critical elements: miniaturized vacuum tubes that could survive acceleration, industrial capacity to mass-produce complex electronics, and centralized coordination of research efforts. The fragmentation proved fatal. While America concentrated all proximity fuse research under Tuve at Section T, Germany had competing programs at Luftwaffe, Wehrmacht, Kriegsmarine, and SS research facilities, none sharing information with the others. Japan's situation was even more desperate. Lieutenant Commander Yuzuru Fukao of the Imperial Japanese Navy Technical Research Institute later testified, "We knew by 1943 that American anti-aircraft fire had become impossibly accurate. We suspected some form of proximity fuse, but could not imagine how it functioned. We developed a photoelectric fuse by 1945, tested it once in a dropped bomb, but lacked industrial capacity for production." The Japanese response to proximity fuses was not technological, but tactical. Kamikaze attacks that accepted destruction as the price of reaching the target. It was an admission of technological defeat, trading lives for the inability to match American innovation. Behind the statistics and battle reports were individual stories that illuminate the proximity fuse's human dimension. Merle Tuve carried personal demons that drove his dedication. His father had died in the 1918 influenza pandemic when Merle was 17, forcing the family into poverty. His mother took in washing to pay for his education. The laboratory walls displaying "save time, not money" reflected his understanding that in war, delay meant death. After particularly difficult tests, colleagues would find him alone in his office at 3 a.m., staring at casualty reports from the Pacific, calculating how many lives faster production might save. James Van Allen's transformation from physicist to naval officer proved equally profound. After developing the shock-proof vacuum tubes, he insisted on combat duty to witness his inventions in action. Aboard USS Washington, during the Philippine Sea Battle, he watched his tubes protecting the sailors he served alongside. "It was the most satisfying moment of my scientific career," he later wrote, "seeing theoretical physics save actual lives." Betty Thompson, assembly worker at Crosley Corporation, discovered only at a 1985 reunion what she had built during the war. "For 40 years I thought I'd made radio parts. Then they showed us a film about proximity fuses. I started crying. All those tiny components I soldered, they were saving our boys from kamikaze attacks, and we had no idea we were building miracles. Lieutenant Robert Cochran, who fired the first proximity fuse combat shots from USS Helena, carried the weight of that moment his entire life. In a 1975 interview, he reflected, "I knew we were firing something special." The security briefing made that clear. But when I saw that Japanese plane just come apart in midair without being hit directly, I realized we had something that would change everything. It was like being present at the invention of gunpowder. The proximity fuse's impact can be measured in stark mathematics that reveal its decisive contribution to Allied victory. Naval warfare statistics tell the clearest story. Pre-proximity fuse, 1942, 500 to 2,000 rounds per aircraft destroyed, depending on conditions. With proximity fuses, 1943 to 45, 155 rounds per aircraft destroyed. Improvement factor, 600 to 1,200%. During the entire Pacific War, proximity fuses destroyed an estimated 4,000 Japanese aircraft. Post-war analysis concluded that without proximity fuses, only 650 of these would have been destroyed by conventional ammunition. The 3,350 additional aircraft destroyed by proximity fuses would have killed an estimated 8,000 American sailors and sunk 40 to 50 additional ships. The V-1 defensive campaign provides equally dramatic numbers. London, 2,340 V-1s destroyed by proximity fuses. Without them, based on week 1 success rates, only 560 would have been destroyed. The additional 1,780 V-1s would have killed an estimated 9,000 civilians and wounded 25,000. Antwerp's defense was even more remarkable. 2,183 V-1s destroyed from 2,394 engaged, 91.2% success rate. Without proximity fuses, achieving only the 40% rate of conventional shells, 1,400 additional V-1s would have impacted the port area, likely closing Antwerp and strangling Allied operations in northwest Europe. Ground combat statistics from the Battle of the Bulge: 200,000 proximity-fused shells fired in 2 weeks. Estimated German casualties from proximity fuses, 10,000 to 15,000. Traditional artillery would have achieved perhaps 2,000 casualties with the same ammunition expenditure. The psychological impact, entire units surrendering rather than face airburst bombardment, cannot be quantified but clearly contributed to the German offensive's failure. Production statistics reveal American industrial supremacy: 22,734,811 proximity fuses manufactured, 87 companies involved, 110 factories operating, 80,000 workers at peak production, $1 billion investment, equivalent to $15 billion today. The proximity fuse's importance was recognized at the highest levels of Allied leadership, with testimonials that place it among the war's most decisive technologies. Vannevar Bush, director of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, provided the most comprehensive assessment. The proximity fuse created a 7-fold increase in the effectiveness of 5-inch anti-aircraft artillery in the Pacific, formed an important part of the radar-controlled anti-aircraft batteries that finally neutralized the German V-1 attacks on London and fundamentally changed the tactics of land warfare beginning at the Battle of the Bulge. No other development, save radar and the atomic bomb, had comparable impact on the war's outcome. General Dwight Eisenhower's evaluation carried special weight given his strategic perspective. If the Germans had succeeded in perfecting and using these new weapons 6 months earlier than they did, our invasion of Europe would have proven exceedingly difficult, perhaps impossible. The proximity fuse gave us a decisive advantage at the critical moment. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal declared to Congress in 1945, "The proximity fuse has helped blaze the trail to Japan. Without the protection, this ingenious device has given the surface ships of the fleet our westward push could not have been so swift, and the cost in men and ships would have been immeasurably greater." Admiral Willis A. Lee, commander of battleships in the Pacific, was typically direct. The proximity fuse made the kamikaze survivable. Without it, we would have lost half the fleet at Okinawa. General George Patton's assessment combined tactical appreciation with strategic vision. The proximity fuse won the Battle of the Bulge, but more than that, it showed us the future of warfare, weapons that think for themselves. Thank God we got it first. Winston Churchill, writing in his memoirs, provided a statesman's perspective. The proximity fuse saved London from the flying bomb. It was a weapon of defense that proved more valuable than any offensive weapon, save the atomic bomb itself. And the American genius for mass production of complex devices gave us a shield when we most needed it. Even German leaders in post-war interrogations acknowledged the proximity fuse's impact. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt stated, "The American proximity fuse made our traditional defensive positions untenable. We could no longer rely on entrenchments and fortifications. It was a revolution in artillery that we could neither match nor counter." The proximity fuse didn't just win battles, it revolutionized military doctrine, forcing a complete reconsideration of tactics that had evolved over centuries. Artillery tactics transformed overnight. For 500 years, since the introduction of gunpowder, artillery had been primarily a direct fire or ground-burst weapon. Soldiers protected themselves by digging in. The proximity fuse made entrenchments death traps. Major General James Gavin, commander of the 82nd Airborne Division, wrote in his post-war analysis, "The proximity fuse made traditional infantry tactics obsolete. We had to completely retrain our soldiers. Dispersion became essential. Overhead cover became mandatory. Movement replaced entrenchment as the key to survival." Naval tactics experienced equal transformation. Before proximity fuses, naval task forces required massive fighter umbrellas for protection against air attack. After proximity fuses, surface ships could operate independently, their anti-aircraft batteries providing reliable defense. This flexibility allowed the island-hopping campaign in the Pacific to accelerate dramatically. Admiral Raymond Spruance noted, "The proximity fuse gave us tactical freedom we never had before. We could detach single destroyers for independent operations, knowing they could defend themselves against air attack. This multiplied our effective force by allowing dispersed operations." The proximity fuse represented the first great example of successful Anglo-American technology transfer, a model that would define Allied cooperation throughout the war and into the Cold War. The British provided the concept and initial research. The Americans provided industrial capacity and resources. The combination proved unbeatable. Neither nation alone could have developed and deployed proximity fuses in time to affect the war's outcome. Sir Henry Tizard, reflecting on the technology transfer, wrote, "We gave the Americans our ideas. They gave us back millions of weapons. It was the best trade Britain ever made." The proximity fuse's impact extended far beyond World War II, establishing technologies and techniques that shaped both military and civilian development for decades. The miniaturization techniques developed for proximity fuses directly influenced transistor development and integrated circuit design. James Van Allen applied shock-hardening methods learned from proximity fuses to instruments aboard Explorer 1, America's first satellite, which discovered the Van Allen radiation belts. The organizational model, university laboratories partnering with industry under government coordination, became the template for Cold War research. Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, created specifically for proximity fuse development, continues as one of America's premier defense research institutions, having contributed to everything from submarine-launched ballistic missiles to space exploration. Quality control procedures developed for proximity fuses requiring 80% reliability under extreme conditions established new standards for aerospace and defense industries. The proximity fuse itself evolved into modern smart weapons. Today's radar-guided missiles, laser-guided bombs, and GPS-directed munitions all trace their lineage to the first smart weapon, the proximity fuse, the concept of a thinking weapon. one that could make decisions without human intervention, began with Mullaney's vacuum tubes. In May 1945, American technical intelligence teams racing through defeated Germany made a shocking discovery. In underground facilities and hastily abandoned laboratories, they found extensive German proximity fuse research, far more advanced than anticipated, but still years from deployment. Colonel Howard Dix, leading Technical Intelligence Team 314, reported from the Luftwaffe research facility at Völkenrode. The Germans had proximity fuse programs at every major research institution. They understood the principles perfectly. They had designs that might have worked. What they lacked was our industrial capacity to transform laboratory prototypes into mass production. Dr. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, explained during interrogation, "We knew about proximity fuses from captured American shells in December 1944. Our scientists said they were impossible. No electronics could survive such forces. When we finally believed they were real, it was too late. We lacked the vacuum tube technology, the production facilities, and most importantly, the time." The German failure revealed the proximity fuse's true achievement, not just technical innovation, but the marriage of science and industry on a scale only America could achieve in 1940s wartime conditions. Military historians consistently rank the proximity fuse among World War II's three most decisive technologies, alongside radar and atomic weapons. But unlike the atomic bomb, used only twice, proximity fuses saw continuous combat use from January 1943 through August 1945, affecting thousands of engagements. Dr. Arnold Kramer, military historian at Texas A&M University, concluded, "The proximity fuse killed more enemy soldiers, saved more Allied lives, and influenced more battles than any other secret weapon of World War II. It was the war's most effective secret weapon because it was used everywhere, all the time, with devastating effect." The statistics support this assessment. An estimated 25,000 enemy aircraft destroyed or damaged by proximity fuses, over 5,000 V-1 flying bombs destroyed, tens of thousands of enemy soldiers killed by proximity-fused artillery. Allied lives saved numbered in the hundreds of thousands. But beyond statistics lay transformation. The proximity fuse changed how wars were fought, introducing the age of smart weapons. It demonstrated that technological superiority could provide decisive military advantage. It proved that democratic nations mobilizing civilian science and industry could out-innovate totalitarian regimes. Behind every proximity fuse lay human stories of innovation, sacrifice, and determination. Mullaney never recovered from the war's intensity. Colleagues found him in 1946 sitting alone in his empty laboratory at Johns Hopkins, weeping. "All those boys who died while we were still developing the fuse," he said. "If we'd been faster, even by weeks, how many would have lived?" He spent his remaining years in astronomical research, seeking distance from weapons development. James Van Allen parlayed his wartime experience into pioneering space research. The shock-hardening techniques he developed for proximity fuses protected instruments on early satellites. When asked about his wartime work, he would say simply, "I helped save lives. Everything else I've done pales in comparison." The women who assembled proximity fuses, Betty Morrison at Crosley, Marie Collins at Johns Hopkins, thousands of others whose names are lost, carried their secret service quietly. Most never knew what they built until decades later, if at all. Their nimble fingers and patient precision saved countless lives half a world away. The soldiers and sailors who fired proximity fuses understood their value immediately. Gunner's mate Anthony Puleo of USS Helena spoke for many. "Those green-banded shells were like having God on our side. Every time we loaded one, we knew some American pilot or sailor would live because of it." The proximity fuse program cost approximately $1 billion in 1940s dollars, $15 billion today. It required 87 companies, 110 factories, and 80,000 workers. It consumed resources that could have built thousands of tanks or hundreds of ships. Was it worth it? The answer lies in battles not lost, ships not sunk, cities not destroyed, and most importantly, lives not sacrificed. Every Japanese aircraft destroyed before reaching its target saved American sailors. Every V-1 destroyed before reaching London saved British civilians. Every German soldier killed by airburst artillery couldn't kill Allied soldiers. Admiral Chester Nimitz provided perhaps the best assessment. The proximity fuse was worth 10 divisions of infantry, 100 squadrons of aircraft, an entire fleet of ships. It was force multiplication through technology, the American way of war. History remembers the generals and admirals, the famous battles and dramatic moments. It often forgets the scientists and workers who created the tools of victory. Merle Tuve died in 1982, his name unknown to most Americans, despite his decisive contribution to victory. James Van Allen achieved fame for space research. His wartime work overshadowed Lloyd Berkner, Richard Roberts, Henry Porter. Their names appear only in technical histories. The women who assembled proximity fuses remain almost entirely forgotten. No monuments honor their service. No medals recognize their contribution. Yet their patient precision, working with deadly materials they didn't understand, building weapons they couldn't comprehend, saved more lives than most decorated heroes. Perhaps that anonymity is fitting. The proximity fuse succeeded through collective effort. British scientists sharing secrets, American researchers solving impossible problems, factory workers assembling miracles, soldiers and sailors employing revolutionary weapons. No single hero, but hundreds of thousands contributing to a common cause. 2 weeks after that first devastating use at Monschau, as 1944 turned to 1945, Feldwebel Klaus Richter made his final diary entry. The Battle of the Bulge was failing. German forces were in retreat. American proximity-fused artillery continued its relentless thunder, each air burst illuminating the snow-covered battlefield with deadly efficiency. We face not just American soldiers, but American science, he wrote. Their shells think, they calculate, they decide when to kill. We are fighting the future itself, and the future is winning. God help Germany, for we have awakened a giant whose weapons are guided by intelligence itself. Richter couldn't know how right he was. The proximity fuse represented more than just superior technology. It embodied the advantage of free societies mobilizing civilian expertise for military purposes, while German scientists competed in isolation and Japanese researchers worked in ignorance. American scientists, British physicists, and Canadian engineers collaborated openly, sharing discoveries and solving problems collectively. The proximity fuse was democracy's weapon, created by free people, manufactured by free workers, employed by free soldiers, defending freedom itself. Its development required not just technical skill, but trust. Trust between allies, sharing secrets, between government and universities, between military and civilian sectors. That trust, impossible in totalitarian regimes, provided the decisive advantage. From Buteman's October 1939 concept to mass production by 1943, the proximity fuse traveled from British desperation through American innovation to Allied victory. Along the way, it saved hundreds of thousands of lives, shortened the war by months, if not years, and introduced the age of intelligent weapons that continues today. The proximity fuse proved that wars could be won not just through courage and sacrifice, but through superior technology and industrial might. It demonstrated that thinking weapons could multiply force beyond anything previously imagined. Most importantly, it showed that free nations pooling their intellectual and industrial resources could achieve miracles that totalitarian states could only dream about. In those vacuum tubes that James Van Allen taught to survive impossible forces, in those circuits that Lloyd Berkner designed to detect approaching death, in those assemblies that countless unnamed women soldered with perfect precision, lay the margin between victory and defeat, between freedom and tyranny, between the world we inherited and one too terrible to contemplate. The proximity fuse was indeed the most effective secret weapon of the war, not because it was the most powerful, but because it was used everywhere, continuously, decisively. It was the weapon that thought, and in thinking, it helped thinking people preserve their freedom to think. The German soldiers at Elsenborn Ridge, huddled in bunkers that could no longer protect them, had encountered more than just superior firepower. They had met the future, a future where intelligence embedded in weapons would multiply human capability beyond previous imagination. That future, born in the desperate days of 1940, tested in the crucible of World War and proven on battlefields from the Pacific to Europe, began with a simple idea. What if an artillery shell could think? The answer: save the free world. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.